Hi, everybody. Welcome back. You remember me from last week. Henry Rinsky, Chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture and Regional Planning. Today, again, I'll have my colleague Wade Fida do the introductions of the speaker. As always, we kind of acknowledge the support for the Zube lecture series that we're all a part of today. This series is named for Irv and Margaret Zube. Irv Zube was the head of the Department of Landscape Architecture and Regional Planning from 1974 to 1980. Professor Zube was internationally known for his leadership in developing a culture of academic research in the profession of landscape architecture. And his work made several contributions to landscape planning theory and practice. Irv left UMass for the University of Arizona, where he continued his research and teaching until passing away in 2001. Irv and his wife Margaret endowed this lecture series at UMass, starting in 2004, for the purpose of bringing scholars to the department to stimulate and enrich our academic community in landscape architecture and planning. The Zube Endowment has since been generously supported by alumni, students, and faculty. So thank you all for being here. And so I'll introduce my colleague. Many of you might have had him in class. He's a lecturer in our department, and he's also the director of our Center for Resilient Metro Regions. That's right. I still want to call it rural things. All right, Wade Fiden.
Thank you all. I just want to add that this lecture is co-sponsored by the Community Democracy and Dialogue Grant Program. It's an internal program on campus in an era where maybe democracy is under fire to sort of promote dialogue and discussions between disciplines and groups. So they're co-sponsoring. And then because I'm doing the introduction, I get to make this all about me. So years ago, before any of you were alive, when I went to undergraduate, so I was a senior in high school, and I was really debating what did I want. I was really interested in environmental protection. I was really interested in community change and organizing. And so I went to the University of Michigan for an interview to enter their environmental advocacy program and heard their theoretical description of what community organizing was all about. And then hitchhiked, because that's what I did at the time, down to Arkansas, where Seth Borgos gave me a tour of what Acorn was doing at the time, and sort of took this theoretical framework that I had just heard about in Ann Arbor and sort of translated into real practice. So, sort of always interested in that part. Seth is, I forget the exact title, senior advisor. But he's sort of the theoretical guy, right? Where's the program around? If you're interested in social change movement, his book from 1984, This Mighty Dream, is still one of the best reads that's out there, although it's obviously missed things in the last 40 years. But really interesting in terms of the history of social change movements, and I think he sort of put that in sort of theory and helped build programs. And Jennifer Wells comes from the organizing part of the world. Again, sorry, I don't remember your title, but Jennifer's from the organizing. She has great stories about organizing and sort of learned, I think, by doing. So she learned sort of what the principles are behind organizing and then developed a more theoretical background, which she helped to work. I'll let you guys take it from there.
Let's make sure the mic good, sound good. Okay. Yeah, this point about principles. So I'll tell a little story about myself and then try not to say much. But when I was very young, my mother sent me to day camp to learn how to swim. And she went like 2 or 3 weeks later, and she asked the swimming instructor how to learn to swim. And the instructor said, no, he hasn't actually learned to swim, but he has an excellent understanding of the principles of swimming. Some people think I haven't changed. I am going to try to tell, or we were going to try to tell a story about community organizing. Organizers love stories. And just to give you a sense of what they call the narrative arc, the story begins, there's an origin story. Then there's a story of growth and success. Then there's a story of existential, maybe not crisis, existential challenges, and then it ends on a note of hope. That's the kind of arc. Just a little bit about myself, how I wound up in Arkansas in 1975, pretty much by accident. There are people who grew up, like we know organizers who say, I was born to do this work. I was not. I fell into it. I will not give the whole story. But I wound up a New York kid in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1975, working with this organization, Acorn, which was kind of a pioneer. I don't know if any of you have heard of it anymore. It died around 2010. But for many years, it was a kind of creative force in community organizing. And that was my formative experience. Then I did some other things. I was a funder for a while and wound up at Community Change. Jennifer will say a little bit about the organization. Wound up working on sort of the development of new projects. One of which, childcare, I'll talk a little bit about further on. But that's been my role. I'm not used to doing formal lectures, to be honest. Even though my mother wanted me to be an academic, I never quite made it. So this will be a little informal, and I hope that's okay.
Yeah. I am going to use the podium. I thought I was going to use the laundry mic, but I don't feel like it anymore. How I came into organizing. So I have a little bit of a journey, somewhat similar to Seth. I understand how folks find the spirit, the energy, the oomph that makes them go out in the streets and really take action, become activists. But organizing for me came a slightly different way. I'm born and raised in New Orleans, daughter of the South. I've always loved to lead with that. I currently live in Montgomery, so I've come back to the South. But my journey took me from New Orleans to West Virginia. And the journey was through Hurricane Katrina. And because of that experience, I had an awakening that I really did not want anyone else, if I could help it, if I could be a part of the reason that someone would not experience what me and my family experienced, my city experience, my culture experience. So when I landed in West Virginia, I became a social worker at first. And I love that work. It felt like me giving back, but there's also a side of social work that has organizing almost embedded in it. I am not there to take care of somebody, I'm there to help people navigate systems to hopefully use their power, their voice to overcome certain situations or certain systems. But as I was in the child welfare system, as I began to work with elderly folks and folks in the disability community, as they were trying to fight for their rights and get more services or just receive the health care they just outright deserved and the dignity, I realized that I love the one-to-one work, but it wasn't fulfilling enough for me, nor did I see it making a change. Most of the children and families I dealt with were dealing with deep poverty, and that was the reason why they were systems engaged, right? The reason that a child was standing in court, comping to being absent from school because his school filed a petition against him and his family, did not understand that mom had a job that kept her out of the home and couldn't get him or his siblings ready for school. And therefore, he stayed sometimes to get his younger siblings ready for school, thus sometimes being late for the bus, having no way to walk, because there were no sidewalks in rural West Virginia for him to get to school. And so sometimes was taking absentee days. And when I realized I could help him navigate the court system, I could help him and his mom navigate the situation they were going to be placed in, it still wasn't answering the larger call. And that's when I was called to organizing. And I began organizing as a volunteer, so unpaid organizing in West Virginia. And then I was lucky enough, I do feel it's a privilege, to earn the job of a paid organizer. And then I became the director of the organization, the statewide organization in West Virginia. And let me say, the daughter of the South, it was a little bit of a cultural shock to be in West Virginia, but there were a whole lot more similarities than there were differences. And from there, I moved on. I was actually recruited by Community Change. This is a tendency we have to do. I feel honored to say that I was one of the people that you wanted to recruit, but we tend to pluck people out of their home environments and move them into the national realm, which is a lot different in how you move and how you maneuver, how you strategize, how you support. But I also was very happy to move into that space because there's a lot of resources at the national level that I'm actually able to play and bring down and but connect to the communities that I deeply love, that I am deeply impacted by, and to support their power building. And so at Community Change, I'm the director of care, which, to break it down, my team supports the child care campaigns and work and partners across the country, as well as healthcare, which we're in the fight for our lives right now. And so we have a robust program and body of work that's building in that frame. But I'm gonna stop there, that's a little bit about me, and get into who Community Change is. And so we as an organization have a mission, and since 1968 when we were established, right after Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated, and this was the summer of deep economic unrest and deep unrest in the country with both MLK, Robert F. Kennedy losing their lives. Folks in the movement understood that there has to be an address to the economic harm and hardship that people are experiencing for them to actually feel full citizenship in this country. And so we were built on the theory that if we are building power, we are actually building power and capacity of folks that are directly impacted. So it is not for me, if I am middle class, college educated, to be deciding what mom in Section 8 housing needs. It is for me to support mom in Section 8 housing, to gain her voice, to help build her power, to move with her community and make decisions on what policies are best for her. To actually have the decision-making power to decide where her life and her children's life or her community life is going. And so yeah, we believe in building power, capacity of low-income people, especially low-income people of color, and that is to change policies and institutions that impact their lives. And we, over the course of the last 2 years, have really sat with and dug in our mission, and we've arrived at a North Star that we think sharpens our focus, sharpens our work, and also helps us to, here's the thing, we have to learn how when to say yes, and sometimes when we have to say no, and having a really sharp vision, mission, and a North Star helps you be able to make those informed decisions. And so our North Star is we are building a grassroots movement. Again, we're going back to the people that are directly impacted, whose lives are directly impacted by systems in ways that are not great. And again, listening to them, letting them decide how do we move forward, but building the power so that they are able to abolish poverty. Because at the end of the day, we all need to be able to thrive in this country, and we have the resources to do it. So this is a little bit of a framework of who we are as an organization. So I said we started in 1968. We're a C3 organization mainly, but we understand that you have to have an electoral strategy if you're building power. Like you have to have, there has to be an outlet to that energy. Elections are typically where some of that is seen. We also have a PAC, and we have some pretty snazzy sponsored projects. Can I say where? Yeah, okay. So we are, as a progressive organization, under a little bit of limelight right now with this current administration. And one of them being is that we have a special project that we fiscally sponsor, Free DC. I'm sure you've probably seen them in the news and heard about some of their actions that they're taking to hold ground and occupy DC right now. We have a variety of other special projects that we as an organization feel need the incubation and the opportunity to thrive and to grow and work with area open. We're about 100, I would say close to 100 partners across the country. We, unlike other nationals, do not require the partners that we work with to sign an agreement with us, to pay dues to us. So we don't have affiliates, as sometimes it's noted in like Popular Democracy, which is another national organization, or even how labor unions work. So in the grassroots organizations that we are partnered with, we are literally in relationship with them. There's no binding contract. Yes, we do share resources with them. That's a part of the work that we do. But what we are really trying to build is an alignment together, that we need our agreement of like where we want to build power, who we want to build power with, and what we want to see as a result of that power build. We have about 100 staff members across 20 states. Since COVID, we've become less DC-centric. I'm one of those less DC-centric staffers, and understanding having people embedded in other parts of the country is actually making us richer. Having lived experiences in spaces that are not typically places that people go, I'm going to name it, me living in West Virginia, has offered us just a richer, deeper way of strategizing, building power, conversations, and bringing different perspectives into play. And we did a slim down of our issue areas. We typically campaign under issue areas. And so the priorities that we name as an organization that we see key to abolishing poverty are the care economy, which is the team that I lead, which is inclusive of a very robust child care. Seth is going to talk a bit more about our healthcare work. Healthcare, which I said is like we've been involved in healthcare in the past, but we're really honing in and figuring out what our niche is in the space. And then income. We've always been an economic justice organization. We've dabbled in housing, but when we come back to tax policies, child tax credit, which was a fight that we took on back in 2021, guaranteed income, which is an aspirational economic justice project. We thought that this was the space that we needed to really sit with, hone, build with our partners. So income, economic freedom is actually what we call it. and then immigration. We've long been an incubator of immigrant movement. We had a parting of the ways with a network of immigration groups that we had, how many years, decades we've been in relationship with them. They have spun off, Firm has spun off and to do its own thing. We as Community Change are now deeply reflecting on what our role is in immigrant movement and how to best proceed. That's a little bit about us.
All right, so Community Change, the essence in some ways of the organization, beyond the mission, is a deep investment in community organizing. So let's talk a little bit about what this thing is, community organizing. Some of you probably know, but this is a little bit of a primer history. One thing is there are deep roots. So the American tradition of community organizing is built on a number of much older things. What we call agrarian movements, probably peasant revolts would be a little closer, would probably go back to the origins of agriculture. Labor organization, which goes back at least in Europe to the Middle Ages, maybe further. Activist movements, I think actually I would call them activist campaigns. There's a really interesting book called Bury the Chains, which I would recommend if you've never read it. It's basically a description of the history of the abolition movement in Britain around like between 1760 and 1820. And it's really interesting because in some ways it was the first prototype of what we would call a modern campaign, a modern political campaign that's focused on what we now would call a policy change, a legislative change, that was built on a mass basis, and that developed tactics which are still being used today. So there's a tradition of those kinds of citizen campaigns. There are also very different roots in the sort of what I would call the self-help, resistance, liberation structures that are sort of deeply embedded, particularly in Black and Indigenous communities, but also more broadly in our whole civic culture. And then finally, something we don't talk about a lot, but social work and settlement houses were actually one of the origin points of community organizing. Jane Addams and Hull House was one of the precursors, perhaps. And this becomes evident when we talk about Saul Alinsky. There he is. He was a very controversial figure, and there's a lot of debate and critique about his work, but it is important to understand it in terms of, I'm sorry, I should be closer to the mic, I guess. So Alinsky, he was sort of an arrogant guy, but he never claimed to actually have invented community organizing, but he did, in effect, name it, codify it, turn it into something that was describable. And they listed some of the key moments in his life. There was Back Yards, the first organization that he helped to build in Chicago, near the stockyards. The Industrial Areas Foundation, which was the kind of funding and support structure he built for community organizing. And then two books, Reveille for Radicals, sorry, missing S, and Rules for Radicals, which are worth reading. You have to take them with a grain of salt, I would say. But they are definitely worth reading because they give you some sense of the principles that he espoused. And the point is not necessarily that Alinsky was right about everything. The point is that these ideas, many of these ideas stuck and became kind of foundational to community organizing. So I'll try to go through these quickly. Alinsky made this, and subsequent organizers did even more of this, made this contrast between organization and movement. So movements are big, undisciplined, broad. Organizations are structured and focused and so on. There was this he really built up the idea of the organization and also the organizer. So the idea of the community organizers as a professional who came into communities, helped communities organize, and then left. That, sort of gunslinger image sort of came from him. And there are some people who think that was very problematic, but that was the initial tradition. There was focus on issues that are specifically like immediately realizable with phrase, meaning things that were very concrete and could be solved in a relatively straightforward and potentially quick way. So, and that goes to what I would say was there was sort of an anti-ideological strain in Alinsky's thinking. Remember, this is the 1940s, the era of fascism, communism. It was a very ideological era, and Alinsky sort of tried to insulate organizing from ideology and focus on immediate problems, concrete problems that people had in communities. And he used this phrase, I think he used it, it certainly became a catchphrase called no permanent enemies, no permanent friends, which was, if you compare it, say, to the Communist Party at the time, where, the ideology was there's a permanent class conflict, Alinsky was coming and saying, no, communities have friends at a given moment, and then they have enemies at a given moment, and anything is possible. And that was a very different, at that time at least, a very different philosophy. And then finally, I won't go into all of these things, but finally, most organizing up to that point had identified, was built around a particular demand or issue or need. And the Alinsky idea was that democracy in itself was the end goal. Democracy, voice, etc. And that was pretty different idea, which has informed community organizing ever since, again, for good and bad. There was a period, those ideas didn't take in a very large way for a stretch, and then in the 1960s, when there was a broader social upheaval, they started getting institutionalization and growth in the community organizing world. So this is a list, some of the institutions that were created. The United Farm Workers is an interesting case. They're a labor union, in theory, but they were a labor union that was built on community organizing principles. Cesar Chavez had actually trained as a community organizer first and built the farm workers after that, and a lot of community organizers came out of the farm workers. And then many other organizations, Acorn, the organization I work for, many so-called networks, federations of local organizations. Uh-oh. Critical debate, sorry. So there were, how would I put it? The Alinsky principles, the ones I described, were subject to a critique. As new movements came in, there were folks who said these principles aren't adequate, and I've listed some of the areas of critique. So some people said, actually, we do need permanent alliances. We do need permanent friends. There was a kind of localist thread in community organizing, like local is always better. And there was pushback from people who said, no, you have to have a national, you have to build something national because the problems are at the national level. And that was actually, when I worked for Acorn, that was kind of our view. There was a fight over electoral politics, over whether a lot of organizers said elections are corrupt and we shouldn't have anything to do with it. And then there were others who said, no, we have to participate in the electoral system. And there was a critique around race, gender, and sexual identity, that community organizing had sort of dodged those things and was dealing with sort of popular issues and not confronting these harder issues around race, gender, and other things. And then there were some people who said that the anti-ideological view was inadequate, that you actually do need an ideology, you do need a theory of where you're trying to take the country. As these debates were going on, community organizing actually won some things, and these are some of the things that won. The Community Reinvestment Act, also the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act in the 1970s, was basically a federal law that made banks more accountable in response to community organizing in Chicago and other places. There was housing. There was the launch of the immigrant rights movement that Jennifer described. There was the Affordable Care Act in 2010, where the field organizing was really driven by community organizing networks. There have been places, Hawaii, Massachusetts, California, Minnesota, some places like that, where community organizations have actually built what you might call governing power, have really shaped the policy agenda and the political agenda of those places. And then a little extra was when a community organizer got elected president. Obama, I think up to that time, most people in the larger culture had no idea what you meant by community organizing, and Obama sort of became the visible symbol. So that was where things stood as of around 2010, when I think most community organizers felt we were sort of riding the wave and gaining. And then there are a set of challenges which we're going to talk about briefly. One was around, I don't know the exact, when was Occupy Wall Street? 2011?
2010, I think.
Yeah, or 10.
Yeah.
There was a whole wave of new social movements. Occupy Wall Street, somewhat later Black Lives Matter, Arab Spring, and many others. I'm sure I'm leaving some out. And they look very different from community organizing. They were gigantic, for one thing. They weren't organizations. Like they didn't have tight control. They were sort of very distributed. Everyone is a leader. They were very creative, somewhat disruptive, and they really did change what we call narrative. Like Occupy Wall Street, whatever its weaknesses, did change the way people thought about wealth in this country. Black Lives Matter did change the way people thought about race. And so people in the organizing world, it was a little bit of an existential crisis, because they looked at these movements and said, we have thousands of people, these movements have millions of people. They changed the narrative in some fundamental ways, and we're sort of changing policies. And then there was also, I think, a kind of problem of scale, like how you get to scale with community. So community organizing worked really well at the local level. How do you get to the kind of mass that we need? So this created a kind of existential problem for organizing. You going to talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, I have an example. I firmly sit, and this is personal opinion, I firmly sit in the space that says we need both. We need organizations and we need structure, as well as we need the fire, the visibility, the boldness, the flexibility that movements bring, right? Where I personally can attest that being within an organization, there's a lot of internal bureaucracy that you have to shuffle it. I often say moving things sometimes feels like we're trying to pivot the Titanic before it hits the iceberg, and it's a very difficult act to do in an organization. Whereas with movements, they flow, they move, the leadership changes, the narrative is built. So I firmly sit in the fact that we need both of them. I'm not on an either or category. And one way that I know that they feed off of each other, right, was when the Occupy movement was happening. They get very, very specific in Atlanta with a group that I also work with, which is American Friends Service Committee, which has a long history of organizing and activist movement in this country. And the Atlanta crew, in particular I'm thinking of Tim, who's the leader of the economic project there, saw the Occupy movement, he believed in it, he was out there in the streets with the folks that were protesting and literally occupying space, but he also said, hey, while this is a great new energy, and it's a great group of people that are coming together, what is the next step? Which is always how an organizer thinks to some degree. Like, what's the follow-up? Where do we go next? And there really wasn't an answer as he was in the crowd. So he said, well, here's what I can contribute to this moment, to the movement, is I will deeply began training folks that want to build their leadership, right? So really building the strategy, learning how to campaign, understanding how to bring people in the movement when there isn't a firing moment, which is when the quiet times happen is usually when the bad stuff starts, right? So how are we making certain that we're keeping conversations going, that we're moving people through, and that we're also developing other leaders? So he delved into deep leadership development. And typically, I don't want to say typically, but in sometimes in organizing, you're not always going to see a direct result, right? He believed leadership development was the important thing he could contribute to Occupy, and it would take years before he would actually see some of this come to fruition. And some of it is coming to fruition right now in 2025, where I'm not sure if folks were aware, but there has been a big crackdown on unhoused communities in the South, in Atlanta, with Democratic government being part of the executor of how they dismantle, demolish unhoused communities, right? There was a action taken by the government, the local government, to dismantle an encampment, and without any declaration, they went in and they used a bulldozer and they actually killed one of the occupants of that encampment. And it was that, right? That is typically how a movement or some sort of campaign or some sort of action really takes shape. It sparked. Who came back to Tim were some of the very leaders that he had trained in the Occupy space to say, this is what we're understanding. We have been out doing one-to-ones. We've been talking to community. This is the group of people that we have brought that are essentially the beginning of a core coalition and a core base. Can you help us broaden this? Can you help us broaden this? Can you help support us as we actually think about what the campaign looks like to go after the government that did this, to get retribution for what happened, but then also to build something sustainable for the folks that want housing that they are simply not able to get in the city that is pricing them out. And so they have now been working for the last 90 days since this incident happened on building out a campaign, solidifying the leaders in that movement, training more, bringing more people in, which is always a conversation in organizing. As an organizer myself, I am not supposed to lead anything. I am just supposed to be in the background, making certain that the folks that are, again, directly impacted by this have the skill sets they need, the tools they need in order to move forward with power that they are building. And so it's how do we grow this? How do we get more people involved? Similar to how a movement works, where a movement is instantaneous. People are just there, and now you gotta figure out what to do with them. Organizing is kind of the reverse. You start small and you try to build out. But like that's one of the examples that I have where it's like we feed off both, right? At some point, because of Tim's work, movement is moving towards organizing and towards campaign, but he might not have had that opportunity had Occupy not happened.
Yeah, and the general point I would say is the old orthodoxies, the ones we listed right after Alinsky, have been eroded. Like some of these polarities between local, national, movement, organization, I say that the new wave of organizers have tried to say, we're going to try to synthesize them into both. And that is a fundamental change. Just we'll quickly talk about some of the other things that were going on in society. This is mostly familiar probably to all of you. The decline of trust in institutions across the board was a problem for a field that believed in building institutions. Extreme economic inequality undermined trust. The whole transformation of the media environment, you all know about the rise of social media. All those things were contributing, were eroding the base of what community organizing was, the sort of social base. And then all the political changes, the polarization between parties, the level of partisanship. When I started out in the community organizing world in, whenever it was, late 70s, early 80s, you could talk to legislators of all kinds. And legislators gradually became focused only on their own people and their own base, and people who didn't fit into their base were no longer welcome to talk to them. And that's part of a broader polarization. And coming with that, and I think Jennifer's going to talk about this a little more, growing disillusion with the whole system, which is a real problem. Like organizing is based on people's hopes and beliefs, and the people in the communities we were working with, the people we were trying to organize, were losing hope. So you want to talk about West Virginia?
Yes, I will. Let's see. I had a wonderful I have to thank Brandon Brown, who is my senior organizer, who helped put this presentation together. But I have a curiosity. I don't want to bring some folks in the room. When you see West Virginia, or you begin to hear the threads of John Denver singing Country Roads, what comes to mind? Speak up.
Coal mining.
Yeah. What else?
Hillbilly.
Mm-hmm. What else?
Moonshine.
Moonshine. It's good. I'm gonna say that. I heard something over here, but I couldn't quite hear it. Somebody say it again?
Hilltowns.
Hilltowns?
Yeah.
Milltown.
Milltowns.
Milltowns. I was thinking of Hilltowns, so I thought, yeah, we had the same thing, but both, yeah.
Yeah. All of that is true. Do you think Democratic stronghold? You laugh. I heard it. It's fine. I understand why. What if I tell you that I arrived in 2005 to West Virginia? And when I arrived in 2005, it was a Democratic state. Democratic governor, Democratic legislature, Democratic senator, Democratic congressman, 2005, 20 years ago. And over the course of about 8 years, it began to shift and turn dramatically to what you probably think of as West Virginia now. When you think red, Trump country, heard the word hillbillies is true, they're very rural. Folks that are probably not accessible nor not very forward thinking. I'll just say, name it, because those are the things that I've often heard about West Virginia. And actually, so probably at some points in time, some of the things I even thought about it before I lived there. When I began organizing and working with some folks that were in politics, we were able to make inroads, and to some degree, politicians were persuadable. In our organizing work, when we had campaign work, if we could make the case, if we could tell the story, which is a part of organizing, if we could get a large enough group of people together to say, yes, this is actually happening to me, can you change this policy to better improve my life, whether it be a Democrat or a Republican, you could get into an office, you could have that meeting, and you could probably walk out with some sort of solution making. May not have been 100% what you wanted, may not have been perfect. There were many times that I myself have gone into the offices of Republicans and probably had deeper conversations and more meaningful conversations than when I went into the Democrats' office, to be quite frank. But as coal mining declined, and there was a real shift around 2010 to the 2016s, as more and more coal mines closed down, more of those jobs were lost, as more politicians, including the Democrats, went corporate versus remaining grassroots and in community, we began to find a lot of disengagement in community. We found a lot of separation between us and the folks that were supposedly representing us, be it at the federal level, at the city council level, or at the state level. And so there was just this big disconnect. There was a lot of anger because people were suffering economically. So all the things that Seth laid out about the shifts society-wise or political-wise, we were experiencing firsthand. And when people retreat, when they retreat in anger, what comes up and who's talking to them actually breathes the most air. And what I found in the time that I was there, over the 2 decades that I was there, was that Democrats stopped talking to their people. They began to shift where they were leading, where they thought the power was, what were the policies that they needed to enact, which were sounding way more conservative than liberal, than people-centered. And this is also, let me stop and say, something that I always like to talk about with West Virginia. The largest labor uprising, Blair Mountain, 1921, the government fired on its own people. Why? Because they were radically resisting corporate power. They were radically resisting corporate power, they were fighting for their government, and they were fighting for their rights, and they were harmed. There's a lot of that still lives in West Virginia. There are family members that are still living, that had relatives on Blair Mountain that can tell the story, and also still have the energy. They want to fight. Well, who gets to them? Who talks to them? Who organizes them? Who listens to their stories? Who speaks to their truth? it's usually not the people, and I'm just making an assumption in this room, that we probably are more aligned with. And that's where I saw the deepest shifts. And then I began seeing that representatives or people that were getting to office who were supposedly representing me and my community were suddenly turning a blind ear because they didn't need us. Because we weren't showing up at the polls and we weren't voting and we weren't getting them in office, so they didn't have to feel accountable to us or any of the ways in which we were trying to shift policy or shift the realities of our world. And so it began to snowball. And I lift up West Virginia as an example because that's how quickly it can happen. It's also how folks, and I'm gonna dabble a little bit later on if we have the time, in how the rest of the country views a red state. I feel it in a couple of ways. I feel it because I was in Appalachia for many years. I'm also the daughter of the South, and how the South is viewed. It's not worth the investment. It's not worth the conversations. When we cede those conversations, we don't exactly lose the race we're trying to win. We literally hand it to our opposition. And so there are people in those hills that once you have a sit down, probably over cornbread and beans, and you listen to their stories, they're not much different than anywhere else in the country. And there's also a way to have a dialogue, but we have to start there first, which is the key to organizing.
So on this somewhat somber note, maybe we should just pause and just questions, reactions about this picture. We've gone through it pretty fast. Opinions or questions, challenges are fine. Yes.
I just had a quick question. What are the demographics in West Virginia?
Need to the mic to say this one. 92% white, about 8% black. So as a black organizer in the state, what I would always find when I went in other rooms, I carry a lot of chips on my shoulders. I'm trying not to make them permanent enemies. But what I would find is when I would show up in a room and say I was from West Virginia, people would start laughing. They're like, well, you must be one or two, right? And I'd be like, actually, no, I'm not. There were, and I had to do this research when I first moved there, where were the black communities? Because they were everywhere. Where were they? They were very concentrated in 10 spaces across the state. That if you did a lot of research, you found out that's where the Great Migration brought people. A lot of Alabama coal miners actually went to West Virginia because they had the skill set, they could get jobs. Some of them were recruited there, others just found their way there. But the misnomer of it is a small population, right? But the misnomer was that it had no power. In actuality, where there was concentration, there was an ability to organize and actually build power. You start with local elections. I had a strategy, and there are some people that are still doing this work, where we could shift local elections. And in actuality, when Manchin, former governor, then became senator, when he won his final re-election campaign for senator, he only won his race by 18,000 votes. There are over 56,000 black people in West Virginia. So we began to make the case that you better start being held accountable to our needs because we have some state or sway.
Thank you.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could talk about like the community organizing in like a metropolitan area like Morgantown, kind of like in the north.
Okay, so Morgantown was interesting. Morgantown, because of the college, and there are some slightly progressive spaces in West Virginia, same as in Alabama. I live in Montgomery, I live in a blue city. Birmingham is a blue city. Morgantown was largely a blue city. Because of the university's presence, they held a lot of sway and power. What I used to see mostly coming out of Morgantown, though, was the fight at the city council level. And the friction and the tensions that rise when, yes, somebody says they're blue, yes, someone says they're progressive, but in actuality, their values don't really align with those ideals, right? And ideology. And it was coming out again, that was where we first started to fight the unhoused crisis. And it was in Morgantown where there was some of the most egregious actions taken against folks that were unhoused, that were dealing with mental illness, with other things, even with all the resources available to them and their connections to Pennsylvania and ability to travel to other newer states, Maryland, we're short distances from them. How much they didn't rely on their progressive base to do more. right? It felt, I had more movement, political movement, and I would felt the left, like the good directions. In Huntington, which was solidly red-ish-ish, but had blue, more so than I saw in Morgantown. So there was a lot of nuance, intricacies, but being a university town, by the progressives not having a real foothold and really understanding how they could build power there, they really didn't. It's sad. And then by the corporations that were set up near and around Morgantown. I can talk it afterwards, I don't want to take up too much time, but there's a good story about Morgantown and Mansion.
Yes.
I have a quick question. I feel like you mentioned that you you mentioned you did a lot of work with the unhoused in West Virginia, like through your experience. I feel like for me, I don't really know a lot about rural unhoused like communities. So how did you have to deal with that? Were there any like situations that were just like new and like difficult to organize because of like rural areas? It's like difficult to like navigate maybe?
So there's a lot, thank you for that. So there's a lot around the rural organizing. First, communications that folks are spread out, digital is really hard. I mean, there are certain spaces we didn't have self-service. And so being able to communicate with people, you had to really be at the space and physical space that people gather, be it church, be it school, be it whatever. What we were finding with the unhoused crisis is that it would, yes, show up as encampments, but what people didn't understand was how invisible it could be to the eye. That unhoused meant that there were multiple families living in very small dwelling because at least somebody had a roof, maybe one bedroom, and that they would be very communal and invite community in, but it was because folks could not afford to go out and get their own housing, to get an apartment. The other way that we saw it was in the amount of youth that were couch surfing. And so could be because they were kicked out for various reasons. We had the opioid crisis devastate our state. Because of our isolation, the pharmaceutical companies thought we were a great testing ground, and that's exactly what they did. But that when people were dying, they didn't also understand what the impact was. I mean, there were children that were losing their whole entire family. They were losing mom, dad, everybody to this crisis, and not having a way to support themselves, not having a way, didn't want to go into the system, which I could completely understand why, weren't able to get into the system even if they wanted to. And so you had a lot of folks that were just unaccounted for. Right? So that's another aspect of it when it comes to the rural space and how we were operating in West Virginia. But organizing could be very enriching and also at the same time very difficult. You're talking about going to meetings that were 2 hours away. You're talking about, again, no self-service, they're having a hard time communicating with folks. But at the same time, there were ways in which we would be able to gather.
In an old car, right?
In an old car.
Other things about organizing in general, or we can stick with West Virginia? Reactions to this picture? Yes.
I don't know, I mean, you might bring this up later, and I don't want to pull you off of, what you're going to talk about, but I was really curious and maybe hoping for a little bit of elaboration of how you have seen kind of the changes in the definition of community, which you kind of alluded to, in relation to, Putnam and social capital,
Yeah.
but also community capital. I mean, it used to be a very place-based concept, and now the definition of community is evolved.
Yes. So this is important, I think, that when community organizing started, it was often called like neighborhood organizing, and it was very much about these geographies, these old-fashioned neighborhoods and cities where people have been living together for 40 years. That was kind of a theoretical model. And those neighborhoods have no longer really exist, or barely exist. People move around. The institution, so when Alinsky built back the yards, it was built on churches and unions. And churches and unions have declined along the bowling leagues. So there's actually an active debate going on in the organizing world about, can you build online communities? Are online things really communities, and can you organize around online communities? And I don't know the answer, but it feels like people are building new kinds of communities that aren't so geographically based, and we are trying to figure out how to build on those, but haven't figured out, in my opinion.
We're just testing.
Yeah.
Testing. So it's going back to the don't want to use the word, I have to use the word stuff, I think of another one, constituencies. And so it's how do you identify and using that as a way, if it's like a digital online to offline space, like how are you able to gather? One thing that I'm experiencing right now, and I'll jump ahead a little bit to one of our seeds of hope, is that we're working in birth justice, right? And so we as an organization are not a reproductive justice organization at all. We're a power building organization. And we feel that there's power that's already simmering in that space because there are folks that have been doing this for generations. But like, is there a way in which we can help organize some folks that identify as birth workers? Midwives, doulas. We see them fighting in like fractions, in a little bit of a fractured system around reimbursements at the state level, but is there a unifying call for them to build power at the state level, local level, and even at the federal level? So it's a question we have. We don't have an answer, but just in testing that, how many folks want a conversation, how many folks want to be in community? We put it out last September as a virtual space. Like, hey, we just wanted, it was right after actually Kamala had accepted the nomination, and I was feeling some type of way, and I was like, I wonder if other people just want to be in community. It had that really big call of Black women, 44,000 Black women who gathered, but like specifically looking at it through a birth justice lens, where there folks, or a health lens, if folks want to gather together. We put the call out online, over 1,000 people registered for that call. And they were from all over, and they're from places that typically we had not been as a network, in Connecticut, Hawaii, Oregon. And when they got on the call, they were saying, I wanted to be in this space because I wanted to talk to people that were assumingly experiencing life like I'm experiencing it, want to talk more about what we can do together. We are still holding that call, and we're specifically looking at birth workers, and they're saying, I have a campaign that I want to run in California, and Alabama is saying, well, we're just fighting to just be considered legal in this profession, and how did you win it in California? What are you guys doing in New Jersey? Where are you doing in Oregon? And the conversation is building, and they want to be together. So there is something to be said as we continue this test about how community can begin in a virtual space. My ideal, or what I understand, is where it starts there, it still has to have a local root, right? There still has to be some connector that folks can meet in person to deepen the conversation. If there's a strategy to build, if there's a campaign. And how I said that is we had folks from Mississippi join our call. I then went in person to Mississippi, to the Delta, to have a conversation with some of the folks that were on the call. We gathered more people. And what came out of just that meeting was the fact that every woman around the table had the same story about the same doctor in this very rural space that's very hidden. And as they were around the table understanding, wait a minute, you had the experience, I had the experience. Then it was like, wait, this right now is the villain. This is something that we needed to change that would not have come out online, right? So there was a place to start online, to begin feeling in some way, shape, or form a community that we could actually extend a hand out to, but then the real work and the real questions and some of the real change is still gotta be seated where you live, whom you're surrounded by, and where you can actually build voice and power.
Yeah, and just to build on that, and we promised to end on a note of hope, so that's one. The childcare story, so I don't know if you've seen it, it's actually been a national story. The state of New Mexico has created a universal childcare system where basically anyone who wants, any family that needs childcare can get free childcare through the state. And, you know, there's a whole set of policies around it. They've also raised wages for childcare providers. That victory was won through organizing. We were involved a little, there's a local organization called Olay, there are others, but it is a classic organizing story, and it involved listening to people who said childcare is a crisis, even though it wasn't kind of on the political screen. It involved using a technique that Jennifer's referred to, what we call online to offline, where you actually use online advertising, mostly on Facebook, sometimes Instagram, but to find people, to find hand raisers. Then you follow up as an organizer and have a conversation with them. And that, you're in a sense creating a new kind of community, which is not a geographic community, but is rooted in local areas. And what we found, and particularly became true during the pandemic, is that childcare providers, home-based providers and so on, are great organizers. and are a natural community and a natural constituency. They talk to each other, they talk to the parents, etc. We discovered that somewhat randomly, but they became a powerful force. And in New Mexico, they were able to first win a statewide ballot initiative that allowed them to tap money for universal child care, and now they've kind of instituted it. So that kind of story shows that organizing still works, but it has to adapt to a very different environment than the one that existed 50 years ago. Want to say a little bit about red states?
I think I've said not as much, because I think we're over time.
Are we?
We are.
Oh, no, sorry.
Just a little bit.
No, well, okay.
We're in the Q&A space. So I think I said as much as I should or could. I can answer more questions about red states. It's just the idea that we cannot see ground to, using terrible terms, but the opposition, so I'm just going to say it. We can't see ground to them, right? We can't see conversations and community by just ignoring folks and assuming a lot of organizing really took a shift towards electoral at a certain point where we're really about getting the vote out and we're really about getting that vote, we're really about getting the right candidate and ignoring the fact that people live 365 days out of a year, and when you're not talking to them for 365 days about what they're really experiencing, you can't expect them to all of a sudden run to a ballot and completely understand how that's going to impact their lives. Now, I believe it is a tool that we need to use very wisely, but what we were doing was focusing on that and ignoring community and ignoring personhood, and that is how we left the door open for somebody to whisper in the ear of somebody that's hurting, I have the answer for you. Come my way and I'll show you. They're ignoring it, they're not even talking about it. And that's what I feel happens when we dismiss red states. The other thing that I will say about living in red states, being in red states, is right now, as we are under what is a fascist regime, we've been living under it for a while. Folks in red states and in the South have been living under it for generations. And so there are lessons to be learned about resistance, around strategy, around how to slowly take back what is yours, or at least establish what is yours in a difficult political environment. There are lessons to be learned that I think need to be shared and need to be spread. And so I'm always going to be an advocate for folks coming to the South, talking to us, going to Appalachia and really seeing what it feels like to be in community with folks without an automatic assumption that they're dumb, that they consistently vote against their self-interest, which is the label given to them. But when you talk to them, you'll find out there's way more alignment than there is separation. And that is not to ignore the race and gender issue that this country is founded on. So I'm gonna name that outright. But there are still conversations to be had. Again, there's a way for us not to be thoroughly defeated. So I wanna leave with that hope. Even in a red state, we are winning. One of the case in points was as we were fighting for healthcare, we were fighting for the harm reduction as much as we could with Medicaid. West Virginia, my people that still work there, folks in Indiana and folks in Montana are used to being at the state legislature every year fighting for their lives. Sometimes the biggest thing we could come away with after a 60-day legislative session was the fact we killed some of the worst bills. That literally was the party we would celebrate at the bar when they ended the session. At least that didn't pass, right? And we're always ready for them to try to test the worst of it on us first, right? Because they assume they have an easy pass with super majorities or extremely red legislatures. And so we kept an eye out for this year in particular, what was happening. And in those red states, some things that were super nasty were being teased out language-wise, felt out politically to be passed in those legislatures to be an addition to HR 1, right? We knew they were going to probably, with the numbers, get whatever they wanted on the federal level. Well, they were already starting in the red states to say, well, we got that on the federal level. How can we compound it and make it even worse to put more people off health care, to put more money in the hands of billionaires? And if we test it at those state legislatures, then we can figure out how we can peddle it to the rest. But the warriors that are in those states were like, we learned how to kill bills before, we wanted to get on our train and kill some this year. And they were able to do it. They were able in Montana, in West Virginia, in Indiana, kill bills that would have compounded what is happening to Medicaid at the federal level, even more so in those communities. And I want to lift that up because, again, as they begin to spread this farther and wide, or try to spread this farther and wide, there are lessons to be learned. They talked to Republicans, people they couldn't stand, I know this for a fact, but they were able, even in the shift that has taken place in West Virginia specifically, they were able to still get in the door. In Montana, we're told that they were able to get in the ear of several Republicans whose district races were very tight for the state legislature and explain, this shit comes down, this is gonna cost you your seat. They had a self-interest in staying elected, so they were like, you know what, maybe I can't vote for the worst of it. And so they were able to just get them to not vote at all, right? To not be a part of the majority, therefore it couldn't pass. And so there's just these like sneaky ways that are creative, I won't call them sneaky, they're creative ways. There are alignments, or again, with the no permanent enemies, no permanent friends, really keeping that in your head, alliances you make, how you look at who your spectrum of allies really are and what you need to do with them. Sometimes you can't get their vote, you're never gonna get their vote, but maybe you can move them into the point where they won't vocally disparage what you're trying to do, or they'll just stay quiet and therefore allow whatever work you're doing to continue. And sometimes that's the win you get. But for me, there's a lot to be seen and felt in red states that give me encouragement. And again, if they're fighting this hard to stop the worst, these are people that are not lost to us. These are people that are actually on our side. These are people that if we simply have the time as organizers or as leaders to have conversations, what we're living in does not have to be permanent.
So, we have 5 minutes, just if people have reactions.
When we formally end, if people want to chat with you.
That's a good idea. So if you want to stay, fine. If not, feel free to leave. We won't be
We're not holding
offended.
hostage.
But we do want to leave you with a message of hope that there actually is a way in which community organizing can both transform local communities and change the country.